Hello, good night, Dr. Feinberg.
Good to see you again, Santiago.
I'm glad you're here to explain us.
My pleasure.
These are very interesting topics. I want to introduce you, Mr. Dr. Leslie Feinberg, that he is an expert on physics quantics, and he also is the one who develops the NMT, that is a neuromodulation technique that is quite sophisticated to address many body pains and issues around our daily lives. Dr. Feinberg, the main question I would like to ask you is how should we view the belief or the existence of God through the point of view of physics quantics?
It's an interesting question. I have to say first that I'm not a quantum physicist, but since I was 16, I've been fascinated with the subject, and so as a non-physicist, kind of as a lay person, I've read a great deal and thought a great deal about quantum mechanics. And in developing neuromodulation technique, a method of healing based upon the application of structured intention, my work has been informed very much by the principles of quantum mechanics and the implications of quantum mechanics. And so this question of the existence and the belief in God is something that we should clarify terms first. So I assume, and you'll tell me if I'm right or wrong, that when you say God, you're referring to an all-powerful creative force or entity from which everything else arises. And further, that this all-powerful force is not made of stuff, not made of material. In fact, it is the creative force that made the universe, the earth, the materials, made us. Everything in the physical world came from that godlike source, right?
Yes.
All right. So, having clarified that, I'm going to show you my telephone. So you might wonder if this is an answer to the question, and it's really not. But when we look at this telephone, we see a plain gray screen. There's nothing there. It's blank. There's nothing there until we have the intention to access this. And if I do that now, and we take a look at this phone, what we see is a set of names. And what I can do, and everybody's seen this before, we can scroll through that set of names then, and we can, when we do that, what we see is the list of names accelerates and then it slows down. So, let's imagine something. Let's imagine that there was someone who had been in a coma for 100 years, and somehow we woke them up, and we were having a conversation with them, and we said, hey, you've never seen one of these, what do you think? Now we showed this to them. They've never seen anything electronic. They would look at this and they would say, well, you know, that's an interesting device you have. There must be some mechanism inside of it. There must be some machine inside of it. And in that machine is a roll, maybe a roll of paper or a roll of cloth. And those names must be printed on the cloth. And when you accelerate that cloth, the mechanism slows down gradually as a result of friction, the way any mechanism naturally slows down after force has been removed from it. And it would be a perfectly reasonable thing for them to assume that this was a mechanical device, an actual physical mechanical device. But we know, you and I know, that this is something different than that. And that in fact, even though there's the illusion of mechanism, there's the illusion of some kind of acceleration and then a loss of speed and a stopping as a result of friction, that in fact that's not what's happening. In fact, there's nothing moving here at all. There's no movement. There's only a change in the state, the on and the off state of these pixels that populate the screen. And that's what's really happening. Okay, so let's get back to your question. But I want to use this later as kind of an analogy to help us understand this question. You know, all of us, you and I think, everybody that we know, began looking at the universe in the same way. And we started as babies, and we started with some sense of, I'm here, I am. And then we began looking out beyond ourselves, and we saw mom, and we saw dad, and we saw the nursery. And eventually, over time, we saw more and more things, and we had a expanding and a growing view of what our universe was, initially very simple, and over time it became more densely populated, more complex. But underneath it all, we had this perception that we were here and we were looking out and witnessing some world, some universe that existed beyond ourselves, no? Separate from ourselves. And that's been the view, I think, that has informed mankind for thousands of years. We have, as a species, looked at the nature of the universe. We want to know the nature of the universe and how it's built and how it operates. I mean, these are really the questions that even as infants, as we're born into this world, we ask, who am I? Where am I? And what are the rules? How does this place work that I find myself? And so human beings have, for thousands of years, tried to take a look at the nature of the universe they're in, how it's built, and as we developed science, we began taking things apart. Because, if you can understand the basic building blocks of what your world is made of, in some way you're empowered, aren't you? If you understand how the world is created and built, maybe you can use that information to model the universe or your section of the universe into something that's more acceptable or profitable or abundant for you. So, in science, for many years, there was this process of trying to look at how the universe was structured. A couple thousand years ago, or so, there was a Greek philosopher named Democritus who suggested that everything in the universe, the whole of the universe, was made of what he called atoms. And they were indivisible little particles that everything else was built from. As these atoms would come together, they create the trees and the rocks and the people and the animals and everything that populated the universe. In the late 1900s, technology changed, science changed and developed enough that we actually had some evidence that there really were atoms that made up the universe. And it looked as though we were getting a complete picture of the universe. In fact, around 1900, Lord Kelvin, who was the head of the Royal Society of Science, said that physics was basically over. No young man should consider going into physics because everything was pretty much learned. And it wasn't more than about 20 years later that this world of quantum mechanics opened up. And this was an interesting thing because now technology had developed to the point that science could actually look beyond the atom. And we could look at these individual particles that atoms and everything else then were created of. So we had an opportunity to look at things like electrons and photons and other elementary particles. And that's when everything fell apart. That's when this whole idea that big things were made out of little things fell apart. And this study of quantum mechanics has come to the conclusion that in fact we don't live in a universe that's made out of little things that structure up into bigger and bigger things. We don't live in a universe that is separate, where one thing is separated from another.
Most people, I think, are familiar with this term, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And here's the idea. When these physicists began looking at elementary particles, what they discovered is that if they were able to look at, let's say, the position of an electron, they couldn't know anything about its momentum, its movement. And if they looked at its movement, they couldn't know anything about its position. And the interpretation of that is called the Copenhagen interpretation, is that the reason that this is so is that when we get down to this quantum level, that the illusions of our macro world disappear. And instead, what we see is the real nature of reality. And the real nature of reality is that we see what it is we look for, that our observation is not separate from the thing that we were looking for. And so this whole idea that we had naturally, prior to science, that we had maybe as infants and young children, that we were here and we were looking out at a world formed separate and beyond us, begins falling apart. So this quantum mechanical view then is that the universe is a field of consciousness, and consciousness is what? Even your own consciousness is a place within which ideas and patterns and formation of meaning and significance can take place. That's really what a consciousness is. It's a place that can hold information, isn't it? So this is the idea that our universe is really an undivided field of consciousness, and that it has actually patterned itself into the universe that we see, and that all of the rules that make up the universe, the things like the speed of light, the law of gravity, all these things are choices that this field of consciousness has made. And all the things in it, all the particles, all the structures, including ourselves, are actually very much, now we go back to my telephone, because now we can see the meaning of this analogy that I was using. In other words, if the quantum mechanical view of the universe is true, then there is no separation. Everything exists as a field. So here, just like with the telephone, we have this plain blank field. And in this field are pixels. Each pixel can represent nothing, as we see now, or it can be activated by intention. And intention, again in this analogy, intention allows me to make selections, to make a preference, to make a desire. And in the context of something like the telephone, a simple analogy, I can look at this list of people that I'm interested in finding. But the thing that I know is that the list is only information. There is no actual physical list that exists. And the point is that in this universe, this quantum mechanical universe, there is no real physical stuff. Everything that we experience is not our looking out on a universe that's complete and that exists beyond us. Instead, it's more like each of us has a window from our unique perspective of our life and our understanding into this undivided field of consciousness. And by way of our awareness and our intention, we see what it is that we are interested in within that field of consciousness. So, this is a field in which the macro-universe becomes apparent to us, and it's a field in which there's a resonance between platforms of consciousness that exist. So, if you think of yourself as a subset of that larger field of consciousness, you are that stuff from which that whole is made. Now, if we go back to your original question, how do we think about God and the belief of God, the existence and the belief of God from a quantum mechanical point of view? Here we have a field of consciousness within which the macro-universe arises. It arises as a result of the intention over time, the many choices that the universe has made to create structure within itself. And we do the same thing. That is, from the moment we're born, we have interests, we learn, our consciousness changes based upon our interests and where we direct our intention. And we structure ourselves and we structure our consciousness, and as we mature, we develop capacity, intellectual capacity, the capacity to create, the capacity to enjoy, the capacity to share. And so, in that sense, we become co-creators with that greater field of consciousness. So, when you ask the question, is there a God? And do we believe in a God? It's a matter of semantics in one way. Because from this point of view, we don't see that there's a God outside ourselves, separate from us. Instead, this creative force from which the whole of the universe arises is, we are of the same stuff that it is. Each of us is a piece of that. And we do what it does, which is to think, to open our awareness, to create structure within our minds, to change and to grow in that way. And from that point of view, some people might say that we are, in part, the mind of God, and that our intention and the way in which we create, based upon the awareness and the intellectual creativity and the attention that we place on growth, is in fact part of that whole creative process out of which the whole of the universe arises. There was a question put to the physicist David Bohm, who spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and he was interviewed by a woman named Renee Weber, who was a psychologist at the University of Ohio State University. And the question that she asked, she said, you know, you're describing this field of consciousness. And this field of consciousness sounds like God. It sounds like what we believe God to be. And Bohm said, you know, he says, I don't understand the question. He says, it couldn't possibly be God because we can wrap our minds about it. We can describe it. And he said, just by definition, God must be so much more complex, more subtle, more deep. But I think we can we can kind of simplify our thought about this and simply say that from the standpoint of quantum mechanics, we are part of the creative whole out of which the whole of the universe arises, and that by our intention and our awareness that we participate and we become co-creators in the continual change of the universe and ourselves and each other. And in that sense, God is within us and we are part of that creative process.
Interesting, Doctor. From the same question from the belief on base from physical quantic, the belief-based understanding. It says that it limits our consciousness. No? It says that because you don't walk the way to make the discover. So the belief base limit your consciousness, and your consciousness limit the quality of your life. But how could you interpret that?
Here's my interpretation of that, is that in many religions, God is here and separate and pure and spiritual. And we are down here and we are base and corrupt and made out of material. But that's a classical physics point of view of the world. And if you believe that, if you believe that you are this material stuff that's base and corrupt, and that God and spirituality exist outside you somewhere else, I agree that that's a limiting belief. That's a limiting belief. How can you ever go from down here, this base, corrupt, material existence, and rise to a level of spirituality and empowerment? It's a big challenge. It's not clear how that happens. But in the model that we were just talking about, there is no separation, because the physical world becomes seen as an apparency, something that arises within consciousness. If there is no separation, you and I arise within the same consciousness. This room arises within the same consciousness, not as actual physical stuff, but as pattern of information. Pattern of information like this example. And in that sense, we have a way that we can look at the question of spirituality from a different point of view. We don't have to look at it through the lens of separation, because according to Bell's theorem, the physicist John Stuart Bell in 1964 proved that the universe is non-local. Non-local meaning that, yes, there's an apparent separation between things, but it's not real. And this is accepted universally in physics. So if we live in a universe in which separation doesn't actually exist, it's just an apparency, then we live in a world in which duality is impossible. In other words, there can't be two things. There can't even be two particles, because for there to be two particles, there must be some real separation between them. So if the universe, by definition, by all of the accepted laws of physics that have been discovered, that our modern science agrees upon, if there can't be actual physical stuff in the way that it seems to us, to all of us, then by definition we must live in a universe that is inherently spiritual. Because what does that mean? Spiritual means not having a material underlying nature. And if we look at spirituality from that point of view, then it's not limiting. In fact, it's empowering. From the view of ourselves as actual physical substance that's base and corrupt, and God and spirituality and maybe all the angels and the various levels of spiritual existence are up here, that's very limiting. And we see ourselves in a way that is not empowering. In fact, we may see ourselves with that model, we may see ourselves in a way that encourages us to behave in ways that are base and corrupt toward one another. If I see separation between us, maybe I'm more interested in me than I am about you. But if I interpret our existence as part of an undivided whole, if I see our essential nature as an undivided spiritual entity, this field of consciousness out of which everything arises, maybe I have a more generous attitude toward you because I see in you a projection or a reflection of myself. And if I see in you and in everyone I encounter, and everything I encounter, a reflection of myself, then I'm encouraged to relate to those things in a different way than if I see through the lens of separation and isolation. So I think it's possible to look at spirituality in two ways. And one of those ways, I agree, is very limiting. And it encourages beliefs and behaviors that we see all around us in the world. If you live in a world of separation, then you live in a world in which you're constantly looking to get an advantage over someone else. And, turn on the television or look in the newspaper, and you see the result of that on a large level. You see countries that have missiles pointed at each other, you see people killing one another, you see people taking economic advantage of one another, and you see a society, you see a world that represents what is in fact an inaccurate point of view. That is, it's an inaccurate point of view in the same way that the fellow that we talked about in the beginning of this conversation looked at this device and saw it as an actual mechanical device that we know isn't true. And if we see separation because of our ignorance, then we behave in a way that reflects that ignorance. And I think we see that all around us. But if we see past that, and we see that in fact this is a universe that is non-physical at its most subtle level, that it has an inherent spiritual nature to it, that it's undivided, unseparated, and that everything that exists, you and I and everyone else, are part of an undivided whole, then I think it is not a limiting but an empowering point of view, and a spirituality that can result in peaceful relationships between people, cooperative relationships between people, and can lead to a world in which we all help one another to create a better, more prosperous, more abundant, more loving, more interesting, more beautiful existence for ourselves.
Quite interesting, Doctor. Thank you. Just for the kind of a last question. So consciousness, to increase your consciousness, give you more power, use empowerment, or what's the role of consciousness in our life?
If in fact we live in a world that's not limited by a physical nature, if we live in a world that is in the way that the scientists and philosophers who are familiar with quantum mechanics tell us, then we live in a world that's a world without limitation. It is the role of consciousness to allow us to grow and to create. Many people are familiar with concepts that are kind of popular in the world today. A concept like the law of attraction. Mm. The idea that what we point our attention to and our awareness to with focus and belief and intention is what comes into our life. That in a universe that's not limited by actual physicality, then it's possible for our consciousness by way of its creative processes. To see, to attune to, and by way of its intention and its will, to draw into its experienced reality whatever it has the capacity to see and imagine within that field of infinite potential. So consciousness is a vehicle that allows us to create virtually whatever we would like our lives and our world to be. If we see the world through a lens of scarcity and limitation, what comes to us is a product of our ability to see into that universe of infinite potential. And despite the fact that it's a field of infinite potential, our limited view causes us to select something that's quite unsatisfying. But if we understand the universe in which we exist, and we understand that limitation is only limitation within our consciousness, and we can imagine something larger, something more beautiful, something more abundant, then we can select that. So the role of consciousness, I think, is to give us the freedom to create the kind of existence and the kind of life that would be interesting, would be satisfying, would be aesthetic, beautiful. And this is the opportunity, and this is the challenge that we have, is not that we are born into a place of limited possibilities and we can select this or we can select this, but to recognize that we are co-creators of the universe that we experience. And the more literally and the more fully we understand that, we can use our consciousness to create the kind of world that would be satisfying and interesting and exciting for us to live in. You know, we were talking about this once some time ago with regard to the way you saw the business of
Yes.
the kind of financial
Yes.
services that you provide, and you saw it differently
Yes.
than anybody else saw it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else saw it that way. There was a universe of infinite potential. Somebody 100 years ago could have figured out what you figured out, but nobody did.
Mm-hmm.
The potential was always there. You looked into that field of infinite potential, and that's what you pulled out, was a whole new model for the kind of business that you created, which has been quite successful, as I understand. And that's because you had absolute belief and confidence in your consciousness and what manifested, what arose, what floated to the surface of your consciousness and your creativity. And then you took that and you manifested it into a physical reality. That was the easy part, probably. The hard part was to create that
Yes.
vision. But you had belief. Now, let's say that you had a different way of looking at the world. And every morning you got up and you went, boy, I sure hope, reaching out to someone yourself, I sure hope that I have a great idea, that comes to me and will manifest as a terrific business. There are really two different ways of looking at things, and both involve belief. But I think your belief was in yourself and within your power to manifest reality based upon your creativity and your confidence and your willingness to explore that universe of consciousness within which everything that comes into reality arises. And I think that a much more limiting point of view would be that point of view that here I am and I have to look to a creative source beyond myself. You saw a creative source within yourself, and out of that vision out of that understanding that the creative source, this creative source was within you, you were able to make something quite impressive. So I think that belief is only a limiting thing when the thing that you believe in, when you have the illusion that the power of creation exists outside of yourself. When you see the power of creation within yourself, and that's what you believe in, that's not limiting, that's empowering. So I think belief is important, but it has to be a belief that's based upon accepted scientific principles of reality. And what quantum physics tells us is that we are part of that creative force. It doesn't exist outside of us. It exists within us, and it's the nature of what we are. And when we understand that and we're able to exploit those possibilities, there are few limitations. When we see the creative force as something outside ourselves, then we either become victims of a creative force that ignores us, or we become kind of paupers begging for something that is ours to grasp ourselves. So belief is important, but whether you point that belief inward or you point that belief outward is really the question.
Yes. Thank you, Liz. I think that this last explanation was very clear, no? The difference of beliefs. Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
Very nice.
Little bit of gold, little bit of pearl. Wrap yourself around.